I'm Abbey Esparza with photomanipulation.com, and today we will be learning how to create an e-girl inspired makeup in Photoshop. If you like what you see, go ahead and show us with a like, and if you're new here, why not subscribe? We put out 5 new videos every week, all focused on advanced level photo manipulation. Now let's take a look at what we have here. This is a bit of a long one today, but hand on heart, it's mostly just painting on layers set to multiply and then adding a little bit of a blend if. All of the settings and colors here are completely optional and depend on your specific image and desired outcome. So there is tons of room for experimenting and variation. Skin color is a huge factor in the settings, for instance, but the technique remains the same. This is very similar to my fantasy skin tutorial done on a darker skin tone. The same general idea, just different layer modes essentially. You can, however, grab this exact stock image down below from Adobe Stock. You get 10 images free your first month, so it's a great way to follow along. First things first, we are going to start with the hair. And for this hair, we just need 3 adjustment layers. First, a black and white gradient map set to around 15% or so opacity. Next, a brightness contrast layer set to 35 brightness. And finally, a selective color layer just affecting the reds set to -28, -48, and +58. We are going to group these layers and invert the group's layer mask so that it is filled with black. Control or Command I to invert. Now we can mask in just where we want our new yellowish toned blonde color to show up. I'm using a hair strand brush for this, which will give you a bit more texture and a bit more realistic result, but a semi-hard round brush will work just as well. You can really use any number and combination of adjustment layers here, too. Hue saturation would work great, for instance. Next, if we are talking e-girls, then we have to add some freckles. And frankly, I'm just a huge fan of adding freckles in general, as they add tons of detail and character to a face. And if your subject already has freckles, this can still be used to enhance them. First, we are going to create a new layer, setting it to multiply. Next, we are going to create a new brush. Go ahead and select a hard round brush and open up the brush settings panel. Our settings are going to be as followed. Spacing 1000, size jitter 50, angle jitter 100, roundness jitter 30, scatter 1000, a count of 2, and finally in transfer an opacity jitter of 50% or so. You are going to want to save this brush as it's both easy and annoying to keep remaking over and over again, and it's just kinda handy to have. We are going to set the brush size to 10 to 15 pixels, though you'll want to change the size as you paint, and this will of course depend on the overall size of the subject you are painting on. And we are going to set the color to a lighter, more neutral version of our subject's skin tone. Anything too red or saturated will end up looking more like a pimple or sore, which is sometimes what you might want, so that's a good little trick to keep in mind. You can always try out a few colors and see which works best. Once you are happy with the color, we can finally paint in our freckles. The less perfect, the more real they'll end up looking. Double up the freckles, make some lopsided, and fade some out with a soft round brush, placing some close together while others are far apart. And of course, make sure they vary in size as well as shape. Once you are happy with the placement, go to Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur, and blur around 1 or so pixels, just to help them melt into the skin. Finish them off with a drop shadow layer style, set to color burn, a dark brown, and a low opacity of 30 to 40%, and 0 across the rest of those settings. Again, this will just help blend the freckles into the skin. If you want, you can duplicate, flip, and lower the opacity of your final freckles to make some softer, more faded freckles. Just make sure to remove any freckles that end up on the eyes or fingers. Moving on, we are going to do a nice, sharp, dramatic winged eyeliner effect. We are just going to draw on our winged liner with a hard round brush, placing each wing on its very own layer. If you aren't used to drawing winged liner digitally or in real life, pulling up some references will help here. I don't suggest copying one liner onto the other eye, as the symmetry will be a little too obvious. You are really better off just hand painting each wing. Don't worry about the lash line, as we will be adding in some lashes here in a moment. We are going to want to add a slight Gaussian blur to the liner as well, to get rid of that overly harsh edge. Once happy with the blur, we can then move on to the blend if settings. Focus on blending using the right side toggles, blending away some of the black liner from the highlights. Nothing too crazy, we just want to bring in some of the skin texture onto the liner so they don't look like flat, solid triangles. Each eye will be slightly different. I always just play with the sliders until things look how I like. There's really no magic settings when it comes to blend if. If you're new to Blend If, you can check out my Photoshop tools explained, all focused on the Blend If setting. I'll link it down in the description. Now that we have our eyeliner all done, we can pop on some falsies. Use an eyelash brush as a base. I made my own using a simple stock photo of an eye. It's really easy, but you can also find pre-made lash brushes all over the place. We are going to place our lash and use the transform and warp tools to shape it to become more dramatic and a bit more upturned. Then we can use a layer mask to create a more choppy lash effect. Something a bit more stylized, masking out every other group of eyelash, essentially. I like to use a single hair strand brush for this, but as always, a semi-hard round brush will work just as well. Once happy with our top lashes, we can paint in some matching bottom lashes, painting them in a triangle shape. Dramatic and chunky looking. With that all done, we can finally get to the fun part, the face makeup. The key here is to use a layer set to multiply and a soft round brush set to a very low flow rate. We're talking 1 to 15%. Everything should be very soft and blended. The colors are completely up to you. Today we are going to be using a whole lot of pinks and maybe some peaches here and there. You can always trial and error till you have the perfect shade. And you can always make that shade or shades into a swatch if you want to keep it on hand. With this effect, you can kinda just guess and just use the same general colors from around the same area in the color picker. Getting that same exact pink isn't really that important when it comes to this particular effect. So when painting, I'm focusing the color onto the eyelid and blending outwards, leaving the outer brow bone but slightly going onto the inner eye socket and upper brow. Use an eraser brush to clean up any overspill onto the eyes or any areas you don't want to have eyeshadow on. Again, some reference images might be very helpful here. For the under eye makeup, I like to paint on a new layer just so I can bring in a slightly different tone of pinky peach and lower the opacity independently of the main eyeshadow. If you want your makeup to look more shiny or glossy, which works really well here, you can always use Blend If to blend the color into the highlights, bringing in some of that shine, the natural shine of the eyelid. I'm going to stick with a matte look today, but it is also a good tip if you feel like your makeup is looking too flat or one-dimensional. We can finish up the makeup with a new layer kept to normal and painting in some white, just flat white on the inner eye. Keeping that same low flow brush so you can blend things nicely. Then we are going to use good old Blend If to bring back the shadows of the face, eyelashes, and the inner tip of the eyeliner we drew in earlier. Thanks to Blend If, you really don't have to worry about being too precise. Just make sure to clean up any eyeshadow that may have gotten onto the actual eyeball itself, or on the waterline of the eye as well. For the lips, we're doing basically the same exact thing as we did with the eyes. So let's create a brand new layer set to multiply. Now we want to create a gradient lip effect with really soft edges. Let's lay down our first light pink color. Then a slightly darker pink. And finally a deep berry pink right in the middle of the lips. We want the lipstick to feather past the edges of the lips and have no harsh edges at all. This is why that low flow rate is so important. We also want to remove just some of the lipstick from the outer corner of the lips using a very large, soft, round eraser brush, focusing the color on the inner part of the lips. And if you want to add some color to other parts of the face while you do the lips, go for it. I tend to recommend doing each section of the face on its own layer so you can adjust both opacity and the Blend If settings according to each area's needs. But bringing a little color onto the sockets of the eyes or deepening the already existing eyeshadow is perfectly fine. Speaking of Blend If, we're gonna add some. Blending the color of the lips into the highlights, bringing back some of that shine onto the lips. We will be increasing the glossiness of the lips here soon, but for now we just want the base highlights to show. Moving on to the blush. You're going to want to go hard on the blush, bringing it onto the highest points of the cheeks, connecting it to the eyeshadow, onto the tip of the nose, as well as the bridge of the nose. We are using a couple of different tones of pink with the same low flow brush, again on a layer set to multiply. You can go ahead and drop the blushes layer down to 50 to 60% to avoid it looking like a sunburn, or overly dark and solid. You can lay your initial blush down and then build up some deeper colors onto the nose or upper cheeks on a completely new layer. That will give you more control as you can adjust the opacity of the nose blush as well as the Blend If settings, bringing back some of the nose highlights. The nose blush will also be a bit more solid, and I like to bring the color up the sides of the nose as well. With it being on a different layer than the base blush, I can use the eraser brush without having to worry about affecting anything I'm already happy with. Anytime I move to a different area of the body, like the collarbone, I tend to create a new layer as well. When in doubt, just create a new layer. If you're happy with what you have, create a new layer. So keeping the original highlights on the nose is also important, as we'll be using those as a guide for our painted highlights coming up. All in all, you want a super light hand here, paying close attention to your blending, keeping everything nice and soft. Focus the blush on the upper cheeks and tip of the nose. Again, grab some references if you find yourself struggling with the placement or even the color. And with the blush done, we can start my favorite part. Painting in highlights. Painting highlights takes some practice, especially if you aren't used to any level of digital painting. However, I do want to mention I am not a digital painter, I can't draw. So if I can do it, so can you. My initial highlights are placed on a straight up normal layer. These are the highlights with the most form and shape, as well as the brightest of the highlights. These will give whatever you are placing them on a glossy or wet look. I'm just focusing on the lips and nose today, but you can add these to the cheeks as well as the eyelids. That would look really nice, in fact. The brushes I'm using are linked down below, but as always, you could get the same effect using a hard to semi-hard round brush set to a low flow rate. A tablet is recommended here as both pressure and opacity sensitivity will help get you a natural, more tapered effect, but if you use a mouse, just go slow and paint small sections at a time. A low flow rate and probably a low opacity will help a lot. For the lips, it's super easy as we are just using the lips natural highlights to guide us. With our main highlights placed, we can increase the broader highlights of the face, using a layer set to color dodge and our good old low flow brush, set to various light to medium pinky tones. Bring the layer down to 70% or so to keep things from looking too overly processed. And use a blend if to remove some of the highlights from the shadows of the face. So we want to really make sure they aren't casting or giving off their own light, and that they are indeed being affected by the shadows of the face. We are focusing these highlights on the nose, the middle of the brow, the inner eye, the cheeks, the chin, and the cupid's bow, which is the area right above the upper lip. Once done with that, we can create one more new layer set to normal and add any softer highlights with a white soft round brush, using blend if to blend into the darker areas of the face, similarly to how we did with the inner eye makeup. The nose highlight is going to be the main area to focus on with this layer. So we have our hair, we have our makeup, but no e-girl is finished without some kind of heart or star on their face. Traditionally, these tend to be black, drawn in with some black eyeliner, but we are going with white as I think it's just way cuter. But you can change this from white to black by just adjusting the brightness and contrast layer settings. So we are going to use the same technique that I used in my how to create a digital face paint effect. I'll link that below. But to go over it super quickly, we are creating a black and white gradient map layer set to 40-ish%, along with a brightness contrast layer set to 94 and -50. Those are the settings you are going to want to tinker with if you want a different shade of white or if you want black here. Then we are adjusting the blend if so that they blend into the shadows of the face, and then grouping them and inverting that group's layer mask. This is also similar to what we did with the hair. We are basically using adjustment layers to paint. So on the groups mask is where we are going to mask in our simple shapes. I'm just doing some stars and moons. I made a super basic star brush using shapes. You can of course hand paint them in, I'm just lazy. And the moon is created by painting a solid circle and then masking out half of that circle with the same hard circle brush. Now, once you are done, you'll notice that these are definitely looking very flat and very Photoshoppy. So first, like the freckles, let's give them a slight Gaussian blur. And then let's go to Filter, Distort, Ripple, and bring that slider down to like 40 or so. This will give our stars and moon a really nice hand-drawn feel. It's very subtle, but super effective. You may want to redo this effect a couple times if things look a little too wonky. This is a trial and error effect. I also actually highly recommend going back and doing this to the freckles as well. Finally, you can duplicate the group, create a fresh new black layer mask, and paint in some smaller dot-like stars to finish everything up. giving them that same blur and distort treatment. Also, a quick tip, I used the same layer mask technique to paint this little cute planet drawing on a band-aid, which then has some simple shading and some color adjustments to make it pink. Makeup is a bit hard to teach step by step because there are just so many variables here, but I always have a great time painting makeup. The building up of color is always very satisfying to me, personally. But I think that about does it for today, so like if you like, subscribe if you really like it, and let me know what you'd like to see next, or just say hey down in the comments. I'm Abbey Esparza with photomanipulation.com. See you next time.